So, because I simply can't get enough of sharing books I'm excited by with other readers, one of my side hustles is a monthly page in the Qantas in-flight magazine recommending books. Even if I'm not jumping on a plane quite as often as I'd like, there's something deeply satisfying about being able to steer the reading selections of weary travellers. I like to imagine people getting off their planes, dusting crumbs off their lap, and popping into that airport bookstore off the back of my recommendation. Anyway, last month I wrote one such review for a book called Orpheus Nine. It's the latest novel from Irish-born, Melbourne-based writer Chris Flynn, and it was an enthusiastic recommendation. But something strange happened. The editor of the Qantas mag came back to me, and she gently asked if I might swap it out for a different book. "We worry the content is too graphic," was the message. And while I was stumped, I was not surprised, because the driving premise behind this novel is a particularly bleak kind of horrifying. One day, while watching their primary school-aged children playing a game of football, the people of the small Australian town of Gatton see all the 9-year-olds on the field suddenly die a gruesome death after simultaneously chanting some lines from King Lear in Latin. Something supernatural or otherworldly is afoot, and it's a global phenomenon. Across the world, 130 million children die on that first day, and in the weeks and months afterwards, any child who turns 9 likewise dies horribly. It's maybe not that surprising in hindsight that Qantas had doubts about whether that was the kind of vibe airborne commuters were craving, but the ensuing book is surprising. It's a page-turner, and it's even blackly funny. Amongst its achievements, Flynn sets the whole thing in small-town Australia, following 3 former schoolmates, now adults, who are affected by the phenomenon in different ways. While it's a global, even otherworldly set of stakes, it's understood through the lens of a single community. For anyone who's read Flynn before, the sense of humour and agile play won't come as a surprise, but the ambition and the utterly fearless play with the monstrous find him in new territory. This is an Australian Stephen King novel, horror and social commentary, and more than anything, deeply gripping. So, fasten your child's seatbelt before your own, stow your tray table and snacks, and get ready for a bumpy flight. I'm Michael Williams, and this is Read This, a show about the books we love and the stories behind them. My opening question to you seems self-evident. Who hurt you, Chris Flynn?
No one hurt me.
Were you bullied as a 9-year-old?
I was relentlessly bullied as a child because I was skinny malinky long legs, as my mum used to call me. She said, I've seen better legs hanging out of a bird's nest. Oof, that's rough. That's a hard one to come back from. And my dad was a former bodybuilder. So I was the weakling who's constantly abused for not being able to lift huge fence posts that he could lift with, one hand. But I have nothing against kids personally. I grew up in a foster family, in that my mum and dad were foster parents when I was in my early teens, and my sister was 4 years younger than me. And so throughout my teenage years, we had kids in the house, over 100 little kids, all young. They're all seized by the social services for various reasons, sometimes for a few weeks, sometimes months. In a couple of cases, we had them for years. So I had all these little brothers and sisters, and my sister and I were pseudo-parents. In fact, we'd often walk around the housing estate in Belfast pushing the buggy, and people would assume we were the mum and dad, because there's so many teenage pregnancies of these kids, and we were horrified. Or we would sometimes say, no, we're brother and sister, which would freak people out even more.
That's very reassuring. That's what you want to hear about those teen parents.
That's right, we're brother and sister on top of that. So I sort of grew up being a parent to absolutely loads of little brothers and sisters. But I mean, the beautiful thing about fostering is that you're giving them stability, and then the kids move on. They either would go back to their natural parents, who sometimes would have dependency issues and were sorting themselves out, so they'd get the kids back, or they'd move on to an adoptive family. And the thing was, you were never allowed to see them ever again or have any contact with them whatsoever. If you saw them in the shopping centre, you were told, my mum and dad were told, walk the other way. And partly it's for the good of the kids because they don't want to introduce confusion into their lives. Like, who are you? Well, why do you know me? You know, you assume that they'll just forget you. Yeah. But there's a sadness to that too. And I had never really processed it, I don't think, very well. And I think part of the reason behind this book was that for some reason it just came up. My sister and I never had kids of our own. And we always wonder, is it because some sort of paternal instinct or maternal instinct was satisfied in us? Some switch was flipped and we never felt compelled to.
Or you associated it with an impermanence as well, like that that you invest in it. It's an important thing in your life, but it's not something that you then hold on to. It's not an ongoing thing.
Could be, yeah. And we obviously all those kids are now in their 40s. I don't know what happened to them. Some of them will be alive, some not, probably. But they don't know me.
Yeah.
They probably don't remember that I was a figure in their lives. But I wonder if maybe one of the reasons behind this book subconsciously was me trying to sort of, because all those kids, they might as well be dead to me, you know. And is this book my way of sort of coping with that? I don't know.
If it's a coping mechanism, it's a deeply unhealthy one, and I suggest you get some therapy. That's all I'm saying. I mean, the reason I start there is that when the advanced reading copy of this book arrived, the publisher basically sold it in the advanced reading copy as Chris Flynn was standing at a kids' football game and basically had a vision.
Yes, so what happened to me was I drove myself 7,000 kilometres around Australia, staying in murder motels, visiting over 100 bookshops. And I wanted to do it because it was 2022 and I hadn't got to do that with Mammoth, which was 2020 because everything was locked down. And it was an adventure. But when I got back, the last thing I wanted to think about was books or writing. I got home, thought, okay, I don't want to be bothered with this. And I had a dream like a few days later in which that opening scene of the book is exactly what happened in my dream. I was standing there alongside these parents. I live in a small, regional town. And I was there on the footy ground watching it all happen. And when I got up the next morning, I wrote it down. And it's the opening scene in the book, almost verbatim as it happened in my dream. And then over the next hour, the rest of it all just appeared. And so the whole book was there, right to the ending, right from the beginning. And I thought, oh, bloody hell. Now I'm going to have to write the frigging thing, And it was the start of the summer. I was intending to take some time off. And then I ended up just giving up my summer to sit at my computer every day and watch as this thing appeared before my eyes. So who knows where that came from.
You do something that I particularly love, and I think it's what makes the book work as well as it does, which is you take this kind of speculative, fantastical premise that has global ramifications, but then you write about it in an intensely local way, rather than canvas and here's how it's rolling out in Paris and Tokyo and New York and whatever. You bring it right in and you go very small and very intimate, kind of essentially with three protagonists who are all relating to this global tragedy in their own different ways, and a town called Gatton, which is kind of 7,500 people, small population. Was the town, I mean, are you just writing about where you live and it's thinly veiled and every nasty person in the book is one of your neighbours?
A little bit.
Yeah.
I have to be careful so I don't get hung, drawn and quartered. I tend to not reveal the town that I live in so that people...
I nearly said it then and I was like, no, be nice, Michael, don't do that.
But obviously if I'm speaking to anyone local, no, it's clearly somewhere else, some horrible place in Queensland that's got nothing to do with where I live. But the general framework of the town is very similar to where I live. Yeah, the local thing I think is important for this kind of story. I'm not a big fan of those sort of apocalypse books where it's like, we've got to get on the cargo plane and fly to Paris next and to talk to a scientist, and then he sends us to, Cape Town. Like, boring. Like, how on earth can a person relate to that? And it just seemed a very relatable story from the beginning, a very intimate story from the beginning. And although it's a premise-heavy book, but the premises, as you say, has gotten out of the way at the beginning, and then it's very focused on a local level on how people respond to a disaster, because it all happened to us all, right? There was a global disaster, and we all had to deal with it in our own very localized way because we were actually trapped in our own homes to that sort of degree. And your neighbours, the street you were in, you became very intimate with that. So it made sense to approach it in those terms.
thinking in particular as a Melbourne-based person who went through the COVID lockdowns here, in many ways it has the beats of a pandemic novel. That actually, if you take away the more fantastical elements and you take away some of the more kind of overt body horror stuff, what you have at the heart is a society that's assumptions about itself and how it operates are irretrievably fractured, and trying to find some version of normalcy after that. And in particular, the relationship with salt is very reminiscent of many of the responses to COVID and the anti-vax crowd and that kind of thing. Were you aware of it as a kind of COVID allegory, or is that just something that's easy to impose on it afterwards?
It was imposed a little bit as I went along. I'm not so interested in COVID as I am in how people's opinions. Everyone's got an opinion about everything now. We're expected to be experts on all matters of science, matters of medicine, everything. And I don't know if that's a bit of a layover from COVID, where suddenly we all became very opinionated and experts. But of course, none of us are experts in anything. And so I think that's what fascinated me more about the COVID thing, was how all of a sudden everyone's a scientist. All of a sudden, everyone's choosing to believe certain things they read on the internet whilst ignoring other things because it suits their personal narrative or it's their coping mechanism. And that became the focus of the book, was how you can have neighbours, friends who know each other, who are suddenly, because of something that happens, all sent in various different directions, all believe certain things and all believe they're correct, whereas they're probably all partially correct, but also partially wrong, but not wanting to listen to what the other person's point of view might be.
Part of how that rolls out then in the context of Orpheus Nine is that the overlay of those neighbourly disagreements in the face of something bigger than themselves is all the history and baggage and stories that are not bigger than themselves, that are the ways in which they have come up together in this town, they have had romances and let each other down, and secrets and betrayals and all that kind of stuff. How do you get the stakes right in a book like this, where, you know, you open with a cataclysmic thing? How do you find the space for character stuff, for comedy, even when you're killing off kids on page 3?
Yeah. Well, the killing of kids thing will probably put people off, but you sort of get past that, and it probably will be a bit of an issue for some people. They'll be put off by the idea of it. And I certainly had parents of 9-year-olds, particularly, who've said to me, "I'm not reading this." Whereas other parents of 9-year-olds said, "I'm definitely reading this because my kid does my head in." But how do you sort of get away from that? It's unavoidable that I have to bring up the premise at the beginning and set it up. Once people are past those initial pages, I think they'll find something very different unfolding, because I don't dwell on that. In fact, it's not really mentioned at all after the initial incident. But yeah, how do you develop those characters? The characters were standing next to me on the sidelines, and it sort of, you get this creepy feeling in the back of your neck as an author whenever this happens, because you're like, that seems like quite a complete person there. Where did they come from? Is that an aspect of my personality? Is that sort of an amalgamation of people I know? Who is this woman standing next to me that suddenly I know everything about, including, you know, her life as a teenager? It's hard to pin down where that comes from. But I guess that's kind of the juice for me, is being presented with these characters wherever they're coming from and exploring them, and not really knowing whether anyone will care, but hoping that they do. But also, I love the idea of the premise sends people's lives in a very specific direction. But no one is all bad and no one is all good in this world. And too often in fiction, things are written in those black and white terms, those binary terms, and that doesn't please me. And so I saw an opportunity here. I was like, these characters, you will like them at certain points in the book, and other times you will not like them. And then maybe you'll like them again because you will understand why they've made the choices that they've made. And so it is basically a character study of these 3 characters in the book. And that's probably going to also disappoint some people, because they'll think it's a sort of wham, bam, slam pandemic book about there's been a disaster, you know, when's the SWAT team coming in to sort all this out?
When we return, Chris explains why a sense of mystery is so important to this book, and he shares the holy trinity of books he grew up with. We'll be right back. Amongst the many mysteries in Orpheus Nine, the reciting of the passage from King Lear gives it an element of the supernatural or the otherworldly. That takes it from, this could be a viral contagion, this could be whatever, to something truly freaky. Did you have ideas about what that freakiness was?
So right from the beginning, I knew exactly what this was, and I know how this happened, but I have not revealed that in the book. And some may find that frustrating, but really early on I thought I'm not going to reveal why this is happening, although I know why it's happening, partly because you can only really disappoint by having a resolution. People say, oh, it's aliens. Okay. Oh, that's a bit disappointing. Like you're only going to disappoint people. So I chose to avoid the reveal. But you're right. There's also that mysterious supernatural thing where the kids, before they swell up full of salt, they recite a passage from King Lear in Latin, which introduces that creepiness to it where you're like, there's no way they could know that. Why is that happening? So it gives that tension to the narrative right from the beginning, where you're reminded periodically, okay, so we're dealing with people in a small town who are living with the aftermath of a disaster. They've got their own problems to solve, but also there's this other thing looming over them the whole time that no one's ever really resolving either. And I think that it gives you a through line of the book so you don't forget and you don't get bogged down in domestic politics. You have that constant reminder, that sort of eeriness that casts a shadow over the whole book. And so that was all done on purpose.
I think it's very effective because it means that the dual impulses of the book pull in different directions. It's a very grounded, very realistic book. If you let yourself forget what's led the characters to where they are, everything else about it is society in disarray, small town worrying about kind of who's in charge,
getting Tupperware from Big W.
Yeah, very domestic, very kind of grounded. Do you read a lot of speculative fiction? Do you read a lot of that kind of more fantastical stuff?
I sure do. In fact, I always did as a young reader, and I moved away from it a little bit and got into more literary world, in my sort of 20s and 30s. But I've gone back to it, and I find a lot more satisfaction in sort of speculative and sci-fi light, fantasy light. I love that sort of Black Mirror, Twilight Zone. I've seen so many episodes of the Twilight Zone growing up, and I think that probably influenced me more than I care to acknowledge. That idea that this is a very recognizable world in this story, but there's something off, and we can't quite put our finger on what it is, but we all know there's something off. And, you could argue that is our reality. We all live in a world where we think we have certitude, but we don't really know what's around the corner. As we all learned, the harsh lesson with COVID, we never saw it coming, and suddenly it affected us dramatically. And none of us really know what lies around the corner or where things. We live in an age of uncertainty, but we desperately yearn for certainty. So I think there's a really interesting tension there.
Having an answer to what's happening in Orpheus Nine and withholding that answer from your readers, does that mean it's conceivable there's a scenario where this is a world or a context or a premise that you would return to? Because it does seem to me that pick a different town, pick a major city, pick a different context in which they're responding to the same thing, and there's endless stories that may come out of that.
What you're talking about is what I call the flu, the Flynn literary universe.
Good, magic, set it up.
Where the TV show comes out and then there's an offshoot show set in another country from a different point of view.
Yeah, I've got the branded drinking mug, but otherwise haven't followed all the rest of it.
So because I know what happens, I have had a completely bonkers, totally left field idea for a continuation of the story that would drive people up the wall, but I'll be tempted. If this book does well, I've got a few other things in the pipeline, but if this book does well, then I would consider tackling that. It wouldn't be easy to do, and there'd be a bit of a leap of faith people would have to take with me, and people would probably be like, what the hell is happening now?
See, I can see in your eyes, though, not only is that not off-putting to you, but I suspect that's what gets you up out of bed and writing in the morning is not easy.
Yeah.
confounding readers and making them come and meet you halfway, and a sense of play. Are they the things that get you going?
It totally is. And I've started to get into a bit of a flow state now whenever I'm writing, and then it appears, I'm like, okay, so I'm obviously onto something. I'm not going to question this too much. Like my favorite part of the whole writing process, I love it all. Even the promotion stuff, which a lot of people hate, I love that. I guess I'm a former stage actor when I was young, and I'm a bit of a natural showman maybe, but I really love the moments when the thing is being created and I am laughing at myself thinking, what's wrong with me? Where is this coming from? Because it's a mystery to me. Every time it comes to writing a book, I feel like I'm starting from scratch, and because the ideas are often unusual and the execution of them is very different each time. But that's the joy in it for me.
Apart from your own childhood and that kind of presence of lots of kids in your life, such an important thread through this book is about parental grief, parental sense of responsibility, that kind of bond. Did you workshop this with friends, with kids? Did you pick at the scab of how would you respond to this? How would you deal with it? Or is it entirely an act of imaginative empathy?
No, it is. I did not. I don't let anyone read my work at all whilst I'm working on it. I sort of have a horror of that workshopping of things. Maybe incorrectly, maybe I should, but I'm not from an academic background, so I just have no history of that in me. So I've always sort of been a loner, a solitary writer who just does his own thing. And for years I was writing books in my 20s and 30s that sometimes I would send it to publishers and you'd get pretty form rejections. To give you credit, you were one of the first people to ever throw me a bone in the literary world, because my first book, Tiger in Eden, which came out in 2012, you read a really early draft of that, which is very different to the finished book. And then you met up with me for a coffee, and you didn't really know me, and gave me some very pointed, kind, but also firm advice about what worked and what didn't work. And I was very grateful for that. And then when I, over the following months, I just thought about it. And I think one of the things you said to me was about the voice, because you had heard me speak and you said, I just don't see you in this. And it made me think, oh, is it okay to put me into it? Not as a character, but to channel a voice that comes from my head. And I ended up going away and months later writing that book in the voice of a character who was very similar to the guys I grew up with, but not me, and laughing whilst I was doing it, playing. But for an autodidact, someone who doesn't have, a formal education really, and there was no books in our house growing up. We only had 3 books in our house growing up because my parents are functionally illiterate, The 3 books were, and it sort of says a lot about me, the Illustrated Bible, The House at Pooh Corner by A.A. Milne, and William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist.
Excellent.
So those are the first 3 books
They're the big 3. That's the Holy Trinity.
That's it. But it probably explains a lot of my work.
The main characters in all 3 wear a top but no pants at some point.
You're probably right.
It's a little known link, but there you go.
Yeah, there you go. But for someone from that background, a sort of dopey working class Irish kid, it meant a lot to me that you did that, because it set me on a path that I had never considered before. And isn't that the beauty about being in the arts and taking a risk sometimes, and having a feeling? And sometimes it's those things that make all the difference.
Well, it's the most satisfying part of working book adjacent. And look, Orpheus 9 is magnificent. It deserves to do terribly well, and I hope it does. I hope people don't get scared away by the concept, and they get lured in for your chicanery and trickery, which is there on every page. But it's been great to chat to you today. Thanks for coming in.
Lovely to see you, Michael.
Orpheus 9 by Chris Flynn is available at all good bookstores. Before we go, 2 small things. One, reading Orpheus 9 reminded me of one of my favourite television programs of recent years. It's The Leftovers, which is based on a novel by Tom Perrotta The novel is good. Perotta's the guy who wrote Election, amongst other things. But the TV series is transcendent. It's about the rapture happening and a sizable percentage of the world's population one day disappearing without a trace. It has the same elements of mystery to it, but also kind of existential questions about who we are and what we believe. It's a great show, and I recommend pushing through the somewhat bleak first series. And as for what I've been reading this week, I wanted to mention a crime novel by Scottish writer Christopher Brookmyer. It's called The Cracked Mirror, and it has alternating chapters, one from the perspective of a Miss Marple-style character, written very much in the style of Agatha Christie, and then the alternating chapter is a hard-boiled LA detective written in the style of Michael Connelly. The two different modes of crime shouldn't work together, but the two intertwine as the characters meet each other, and the ensuing book is weird, surprising, and a great one for lovers of crime fiction. You can find it and all the other books we've mentioned today at your favourite independent bookstore. That's it for this week's show. If you enjoyed it, please tell your friends and rate and review us. Next week on Read This, I'm joined by James Bradley to discuss his latest novel, Landfall.
My initial idea was that I wanted to find a way of writing something which put kind of climate migration at the centre. Like I'd already written several books with kind of climate in them, but I wanted one that was more explicitly engaged with kind of questions of justice and questions of dislocation and, refugees and those kinds of issues.
Read This is a Schwartz Media production made possible thanks to the generous support of the ARA Group. The show is produced and edited by Clara Ames with mixing and original compositions by Zoltan Fletcher. Thanks for listening. See you next week.